Okay guys, the next weapon we're going to look at now is the sap or the blackjack, sometimes called a slapper or a slapjack. There are many different variations. Some of them will be more baton-like, consisting of a spring with a lead weight. Others will be a metal flex plate, usually with a weighted end between multiple plies of leather. They look like a beaver tail. For the purposes of this demo, I'll use one of our trainers, so that would be like what's called a mini or a pocket slapper. Both of these tools have some degree of flexibility to them and are extremely powerful. I put out a download about a year and a half ago on shillelagh and cane fighting, and I had a very, very small section on blackjacks because it was from our St. Patrick's Day themed class, and I got so many questions from it. I knew that I had to do a more detailed treatment. So the first thing I would like to cover is that the majority of the questions I got were disbelieving the power of the blackjack. If you've never held one, it's very easy to underestimate it, and if you've held one but never used it, it's still possible. So let's compare it for a moment to the Monadnock Junior. They're both the exact same length, and they're both almost the identical weight. What's the major difference? Well, of course, the Monadnock has that power safety tip. It has a weighted end, but that weighted end is largely hollow. So you see its center of balance is pretty much right in the middle. It literally, with the thinness of the shaft, equals to about the same weight as the handle itself. Whereas a blackjack or a slapjack is significantly heavier in the tip. Its center is somewhere around here, right? So you get an idea of how heavy that tip is. This one has been bent crooked. It's not a high quality one. This is a like a Chinese knockoff one that's about 20 bucks. This is what I use for training, this quality, if I want to smash something up, and then I have nicer quality ones that I would use for everyday carry. So a few things to understand about the blackjack or the slapper. They pack a tremendous impact. Because they are flexible, the moment you begin to swing, the blackjack or the spring basically goes backwards. So that when you arrive at the hit, it's adding that elasticity to the impact. That's compounded massively by the weight of that lead tip or that steel tip. Secondly, because the recoil is largely absorbed by the spring, you can go through it with full abandon and not really feel any of the shock in your body. That means you have full retention in your grip. It's an extremely solid and easy weapon to retain on impact. Thirdly, there is that little micro vibration on impact. It just kind of goes through the body. I can't express to you the difference. If I hit my hand like this with the Monadnock Junior, I get a local sting, a little line of sting. It hurts, it's not insignificant, but even with half power, this is much more significant. A lot of people disbelieve the effectiveness of blackjacks and slappers because they look counterintuitive, they look odd. Keep in mind, guys, from the late 1800s, certainly throughout the majority of the 1900s, this was the main go-to weapon for law enforcement. And the main reasons that it fell out of favor was, as I've said elsewhere, because the weapon produced catastrophic head injuries. Unlike a steel baton that gave you the extension and the length, you know, to go for a leg or seek secondary targets, the blackjack really favored shots to the head and the neck. And as such, with the power, the flexibility, the weighted end, and that preference of target, it was very difficult to control the impact, the ramifications of that hit. So they eventually fell into disfavor. But up into the 1960s, they were mainstays for police officers. By the 80s and 90s, we saw perhaps less than 10% of police forces in North America using them. And even today, the blackjack is largely outlawed for police. It's considered to be excessive, but a lot of uniforms still have pockets expressly designed for the blackjack, which is how they were carried. And a lot of old-timers, you know, still would sneak these in even though they weren't supposed to be carrying them. Doormen and security officers have carried them, but I want to emphasize this very clearly. There is no doubt that they are extremely effective. But they are specifically mentioned in many criminal codes. They fell out of favor for police also because they were so popular with organized criminals and gangsters. It was a weapon of choice for close quarter beating, and so it also had a negative reputation because of that. And as such, it is featured in a lot of criminal codes and specifically mentioned. So if you use a blackjack, if you carry a blackjack, you wield it, you use it, and you get caught having used it, no matter how justified you were in defending yourself, the fact that you had a premeditated illegal weapon shows that you had the intent to do harm, the intent, malicious intent to do excessive damage to the subject. So it can get you in a lot of trouble. That being said, the sheer effectiveness of them makes a lot of people carry them. If I had a choice between stabbing somebody or smacking them with a blackjack, I would far rather smack them with a blackjack. But make no mistake, there is no comparing the impact of a flashlight or a suitably lengthed baton, even a slightly longer baton, although it might have greater range. The impact is simply not the same as a blackjack. Okay guys, the moment I begin to work on any kind of punching bag or even focus mitts for that matter, I will generally evolve to one of my training variants. You can buy training saps. I've seen some companies that make them with just leather and they don't put the metal inside. But what I've done, I've made a video on YouTube. You can look it up, how to make brass knuckles, saps, and blackjacks under my name. I've simply affixed a strap to 2 plies of jigsaw mat, so it's fully flexible, a little bit more forgiving if you're doing stabs. In the case of the blackjack, I've still put a spring in there with a hollow pipe fitting at the end, and I've heavily wrapped it with foam. This is the actual trainer that knocked me out through the helmet. Still fits right in the groove. Fantastic. So this will be a little bit more forgiving. The real leather ones tend to start to rip into the rubber on Bob, and they definitely mark up a lot more than the duct tape will. Now, there are tons of tutorials you can find out there on how to do these, complex different types of strikes, but the reality is this: from your everyday interview kind of phase, any distance is enough to create tremendous power. Where are the ideal targets I would love? I would love to get the mandibular angle underneath the ear behind the jawbone. That is a fantastic knockout point, and I would simply go through that with as much power as I could generate. That being said, if I hit anywhere on the jaw, I'm likely to cause a break or a dislocation. Temple is definitely going to be a knockout, but it could also cause a lot of fracturing in the bone. Old timers would often advocate smacking down onto the top of the head, and that will cause a lot of damage. By comparison, if I'm using a sap or a slapper like this, I can choose to use the edge or the flat portion. So in a lot of ways, this is much more humane than the small billy club. A flat slap to the top of the head like that, going down and through, is extremely likely to cause a knockout. Moreover, simply slapping, it's almost like I want to come up and hit to the side of the head. In fact, one of the first people that ever taught me, an old Irishman, said that if he was getting up close and it was sort of more of a conversational sucker punch ambush kind of attack, he would simply keep it in the hand like that and smack in. To this point, you'll see I previously mentioned the Irish brass knuckle, which is sometimes called a palm slap. That's an ingot of lead that is affixed by a strap to the palm. They even make finger saps, which are weighted lead discs that are put on like rings. Some people will wear 4 independent ones because it's small and mobile and lets them move their hands like regular life. Others might be slightly larger and you would insert 2 fingers into them. Of course, they don't carry the same mass. They do provide a little bit more punch, kind of like heavy jewelry. There are modern self-defense schools that make these little polycarbon rings you slip on that are supposed to give you pain control. I think this is getting too precious and too fancy, and it's not really likely to give you much advantage. But our main indicated strike that we like would be somewhere along the side of the neck or under the ear. Make no mistake, you could kill somebody with this hit, you could cause severe lasting damage, but if you want to put them down fast, that's a main target. Second targets in that vicinity would be the clavicle. Clavicle is highly breakable with something like that. Even the lightness of this trainer, or if I take an actual one, I just tap, that's already getting uncomfortable. Listen to the power difference between the trainer and the real one. Right, the real one puts Bob down a centimeter or 2. So on the clavicle, that would be more than enough to cause a good stun from behind on the top of the trapeziuses. hitting in here is also a great shot. I would use essentially the same striking pattern I saw earlier, which is my basic figure eight strike. One of the biggest grievances I have with most people that teach blackjack or sap is they get too precious. You know, they try to do very particular, specific targets. I just want my basic X going through. I'm looking for my hit. If there are limbs in the way, anywhere on those limbs is going to cause damage. And I'm either going through the limb and back into the head and back into the head, or else we're going to introduce a second option, which is a windmill strike, meaning I'm hitting the limb and just swinging through a second time. 1, 2. So if I have a bob without limbs, I can do the first shot in the air, second shot coming through. 1, 2. 1, 2. So that simple shot is a fantastic way. Just power through limbs, hey, and come into the head. You'll see when we do training with the trainer, we will put on a full-size boxing glove and a forearm pad, and even this through the glove, when I'm throwing a punch and this comes down, is enough to cause damage to my hand. It starts to add up. Sometimes it catches you in the nerve. I got to have a really well-closed fist, have it padded up. Sometimes I'll even wrap the hands under the gloves when I throw it, and I want a boxing glove with as much weight and mass on the front as possible. You definitely want the forearm pad, because even this trainer on the bone is really bruising. My hands start to fail after just a few reps. The other thing people will sometimes question is, but how am I supposed to hit fists out of the air? Look, it's very difficult to catch punches and, you know, perform small joint locks and things like that to functionalize and make, you know, Japanese jiu-jitsu or old school aikido work in the real world. It's very tough. But intercepting a fast punch with a sap or a blackjack is not as hard as you think. It's a little bit more demanding than a jab catch. If you can parry and pat, then all you need to do is add a little bit of spank. When we add a little bit of musculature, a little bit of contraction, we tend to get a little less precise and a little slower. So it does need to be trained. But I can tell you that we routinely train full speed jabs and crosses and teach the students to intercept, and they intercept the vast majority with reliable, destructive force with the smallest amount of shot, because even these little actions like this are evoking the spring. So when you see the spring on the actual one, when I start doing that kind of work, that's more than enough to stop a hand. My trainers, among the many, many, many variations I made, is I made them slightly less springy. I bought springs that weren't as strong, and I choke them up quite a bit. So I'll go through, but I don't get the same recession and launch that you would on a real one, because if you had that, even the trainer would start to break. I made one out of a braided hemp rope and put a PVC coupling at the end, duct taped it, and even that lightweight with that flexibility, that whip, was causing too much damage through gloves. This one obviously was too much through a helmet from my skull. So we learn and we adapt.
Oh, terrible.
That's why I'm going to.
Oh,